The day I discovered my children were already dividing up my estate while I was still breathing was the day I decided to teach them the most important lesson of their lives. And let me tell you, it was a lesson that would cost them exactly $3 million and change their entire perspective on what family truly means. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is William Anderson, but everyone calls me Bill. And at 71 years old, I thought I had seen everything life had to offer, but nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal I was about to uncover from the three people I had spent my entire life providing for, protecting and loving unconditionally. You see, I built my fortune the hard way, starting with absolutely nothing but a high school diploma and a willingness to work 18-hour days, 7 days a week. Because that's what you did when you had dreams bigger than your circumstances and a family depending on you to make something of yourself. My late wife, Sarah, God rest her beautiful soul, had stood by me through every sleepless night, every failed venture, every small victory, and every major triumph, until breast cancer stole her from me 2 years ago, leaving me alone in our 6-bedroom colonial house in Westchester County, with nothing but memories and the echoing silence of rooms that used to be filled with laughter. Together, Sarah and I had raised 3 children who I thought would be my greatest achievement. But as I'm about to tell you, sometimes the very people you would die for are the ones calculating how much they'll inherit when you do. My eldest son, James, was 45 and had inherited my height and my strong jaw, but somehow none of my work ethic, preferring to float from one failed business venture to another, always with his hand out for just one more loan that would definitely be the last one he would ever need. James had married a woman named Victoria who came from old money that had long since dried up, but she still acted like she was American royalty, spending money they didn't have on country club memberships and private schools for their 2 sons, who were being raised to believe that grandfather's money was their birthright. My daughter Elizabeth, or Liz as she insisted on being called, was 42 and lived in Manhattan, working as a corporate attorney for a firm that handled mergers and acquisitions, making more money in a year than I made in my first decade of business. But somehow she was always broke, always needing help with her mortgage or her credit cards or her 3rd divorce lawyer. Liz had expensive taste in everything from her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park to the men she dated, who were invariably younger than her and invariably interested in her for her perceived wealth, rather than her personality, which had become sharp and bitter over the years like expensive wine that had turned to vinegar. My youngest, Robert, or Bobby as we still called him despite him being 39 years old, had all the intelligence in the world, having graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School with honors, but he had chosen to waste his talents running a concierge medical practice that catered to hypochondriacs with too much money and not enough real problems. Bobby lived in a converted loft in Brooklyn that cost more per month than most families made in 3 months, and he spent his free time and my money collecting vintage guitars that he couldn't play and motorcycles that he was too scared to ride properly. The first sign that something was seriously wrong with my children's values came about 6 months ago, when I had what the doctors called a minor cardiac episode, which is medical speak for your heart reminding you that you're not immortal and you need to start taking things seriously. I was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital, where I spent 5 days being poked and prodded and tested, while machines beeped around me and nurses came in every hour to check my vitals and ask me if I was comfortable, which I wasn't, but I appreciated them asking anyway. Within 3 hours of getting the call about my hospitalization, all 3 of my children had arrived at the hospital, but not with the worried faces and comforting words you might expect from loving children concerned about their father's health. Instead, I watched from my hospital bed as they huddled in the corner of my room, whispering urgently among themselves. And I could hear enough to understand that they weren't discussing my medical care or prognosis, but rather the implications of my condition on their expected inheritance. James was already on his phone with someone I assumed was his financial advisor, asking about the tax implications of inheriting real estate and whether it would be better to sell immediately or hold onto properties for a certain period to minimize capital gains taxes. Liz had her laptop out and was researching estate law right there in my hospital room, occasionally glancing at me like I was already a corpse before returning to her screen, where I could see she was calculating something that involved a lot of zeros. Bobby was the least subtle of all, actually asking one of the doctors in the hallway, loud enough for me to hear, what the typical prognosis was for someone in my condition, and whether they thought I would need long-term care which could potentially drain the estate's resources. Not one of them sat beside my bed to hold my hand or asked if I was scared or in pain, or needed anything to make me more comfortable. They were too busy planning their futures with money I hadn't even left them, yet treating me like I was already in the ground. The only person who showed genuine concern for my well-being was Carlos, my gardener, who had been taking care of my property for the past 12 years, and who came to visit me on his day off, bringing a handmade get-well card from his children and a thermos of soup his wife Maria had made. Carlos sat with me for 2 hours just talking about normal things like how the roses were blooming early this year, and how his son Miguel had made the varsity soccer team, and his daughter Sophia was applying to colleges hoping to become a teacher, and the whole time he never once mentioned money or asked for anything, just treated me like a human being who needed company. When visiting hours ended, Carlos shook my hand gently and told me that he would make sure the garden stayed perfect for when I came home, because he knew how much I loved sitting on the back porch in the evening, watching the sunset over the lawn that he kept as pristine as any golf course. The contrast between Carlos's genuine kindness and my children's naked greed was so stark that it kept me awake that night despite the morphine drip, staring at the ceiling and wondering where I had gone wrong in raising them to be such cold, calculating people. After I was released from the hospital, with a clean bill of health and instructions to take it easy and avoid stress, which was ironic considering my children were my biggest source of stress, I decided to conduct a little experiment to see just how deep their greed really ran. I started dropping hints that I was feeling weaker than I actually was, canceling our usual monthly dinners, claiming I was too tired, and having groceries delivered instead of going to the store myself, even though I was perfectly capable of driving and shopping. Sure enough, within days of starting this act, my children suddenly became much more attentive, calling daily to check on me, though their concern was transparently fake, and visiting more frequently, though they spent most of their visits either trying to get me to discuss my will or cataloging my possessions with their eyes. James started showing up every Sunday with paperwork he wanted me to review and sign, always related to power of attorney, or adding him as a signatory on my accounts, which he claimed was just in case something happened and decisions needed to be made quickly, but I knew better. He would sit in my study looking around at the artwork and first edition books, calculating their value in his head, while pretending to be concerned about my health, asking leading questions about whether I had updated my will recently, and if I had considered the tax advantages of transferring assets before death. Liz took a different approach, trying to bond with me over photo albums and family memories, but she was really just trying to identify which pieces of her mother's jewelry were the most valuable and whether I still had the documentation for the paintings and antiques that Sarah had collected over the years. She actually brought an appraiser friend to lunch one day claiming he was just a colleague who happened to be free. But I caught him taking photos of the Monet in the dining room when he thought I wasn't looking, and Liz didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed when I confronted them about it. Bobby, meanwhile, was pushing hard for me to give him medical power of attorney, arguing that, as a doctor, he was the only one qualified to make decisions about my care if I became incapacitated. But what he really wanted was the ability to declare me incompetent and take control of my assets. He kept suggesting that I showed signs of confusion and memory loss, even though I could still beat him at chess with my eyes closed and remember every detail of his childhood, including all the times I had bylaid him out of trouble that he conveniently seemed to have forgotten about. The most revealing moment came when I deliberately left a bank statement on the kitchen table, showing a balance of $800,000 in just one of my accounts, and then pretended to be napping in the living room when James came over for his weekly visit of supposed concern. I watched through barely opened eyes as he photographed the statement with his phone, then called his wife Victoria to excitedly report what he had found, and I could hear her squealing through the phone about how they could finally afford that house in the Hamptons they had been dreaming about. What they didn't know was that I had several other accounts they had no idea existed and properties in trust that wouldn't show up in any simple asset search plus investment portfolios that had been carefully structured to be as private as legally possible. Because I had learned long ago that money makes people crazy, even your own family. A month into my experiment, I overheard a conversation that absolutely shattered any remaining illusions I had about my children's character when they met at my house thinking I was at a doctor's appointment, but I had actually canceled and come home early, parking down the street and entering through the back door. They were in the dining room discussing what they called the situation, which was apparently me being alive and in control of my own finances, and they were actually debating whether they could have me declared incompetent and take control of my estate while I was still living. Liz was explaining the legal requirements for conservatorship and how they would need to prove I was unable to manage my affairs, which would be difficult given that I was still sharp as a tack and had no actual medical conditions that affected my cognition. But she thought they could find a doctor who would be sympathetic to their cause. James was arguing that it would be easier to just wait, but that every month that passed was potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical costs that could eat into their inheritance, and he actually used the phrase burn rate, like I was a failing startup that needed to be shut down to stop the bleeding. Bobby suggested that maybe they could convince me to sign a DNR and refuse any life-extending treatments, because quality of life was more important than quantity, which would have been a valid philosophical position if it wasn't obviously motivated by greed rather than concern for my well-being. They spent 2 hours strategizing about how to maximize their inheritance, even discussing whether they should contest the will if any of them got less than an equal share, and whether they could challenge any charitable donations I might make as evidence of mental decline. The most painful part was when Liz said that it would have been better if I had died at the same time as Mom, because then they wouldn't have to deal with this prolonged waiting and uncertainty. And both of her brothers agreed without hesitation, as if I was nothing more than an inconvenience standing between them and their money. That night I called my lawyer David Steinberg, who had been handling my affairs for 15 years, and told him I needed to completely restructure my will, and that I wanted it done immediately and in complete secrecy without any possibility of my children finding out, until it was too late to contest anything. David wasn't surprised by my decision, because he had met my children many times over the years, and had privately told me more than once that they seemed more interested in my net worth than my well-being. But he had been too professional to push the issue until I brought it up myself. We met the next day at his office in the city, where I laid out exactly what I wanted to happen with my estate. And while he initially tried to talk me out of it, suggesting that I was making an emotional decision that I might regret, I assured him that this was the most rational decision I had ever made. The new will was elegant in its simplicity, leaving the bulk of my estate, including all properties, investments, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $3.2 million, to Carlos Mendoza, my gardener, who had shown me more genuine kindness and respect in 12 years than my children had shown me in their entire lives. I included detailed provisions for how the money should be structured in trusts to protect Carlos and his family from the tax burden, and to ensure that the wealth would be preserved for his children's education and future opportunities, rather than being squandered on luxuries. For my own children, I left carefully chosen symbolic inheritances that would make my disappointment clear, while preventing them from contesting the will on grounds of being forgotten or overlooked, which David assured me was important for making the document legally bulletproof. James would receive my father's pocket watch, which he had always claimed to admire, but had never once asked about its history, or the man who had carried it through the Korean War, and built his own business from nothing, just like I had built mine from scratch. Liz would get her mother's engagement ring, which she had been eyeing since the funeral, but which came with a letter Sarah had written years ago about how true wealth was measured in love and relationships, not money, and how she had been happiest when we were young and poor but together. Bobby would receive my collection of medical journals, from when I had briefly considered becoming a doctor myself, before choosing business instead, journals that might remind him of what it meant to have a calling that was about helping people, rather than making money from their fears and insecurities. Each of them would also receive exactly $1,000 in cash, which David said was enough to prevent any claims of disinheritance, but small enough to make my displeasure abundantly clear. And I insisted it be paid in $20 bills, so they would have to count out their inheritance bill by bill. I also included a detailed letter to be read at the will reading, explaining exactly why I had made these decisions, including transcripts of their conversations about my estate, and their plans to have me declared incompetent, so they would know that I had been fully aware of their scheming all along. The letter also explained that Carlos and his family represented the values I had tried and failed to instill in my own children, including hard work, loyalty, genuine compassion, and the understanding that relationships were more valuable than money, and that taking care of family meant more than just waiting for them to die. To make sure my children couldn't claim that I had been manipulated or was not of sound mind, when I made these changes, I had David arrange for a psychological evaluation and cognitive assessment, which I passed with flying colors, much to the disappointment of my children when they eventually found out about it. I also had myself videotaped reading the will and explaining my reasoning in clear, precise terms, with David and 2 other witnesses present to verify that I was under no duress and was making these decisions of my own free will with full understanding of the consequences. The best part of my plan was that I wasn't actually dying or even particularly sick, beyond the normal ailments of a man in his 70s who had worked hard his whole life and was entitled to feel a little tired now and then. But my children were so blinded by greed that they never bothered to verify my supposed decline. Over the next 3 months, I continued to play the part of a dying man, getting progressively weaker and more frail when they were around, while secretly maintaining my normal routine when they weren't, including playing tennis twice a week at the club and taking long walks in the park every morning. I even joined a book club at the library and started taking cooking classes at the community center, filling my life with activities and people who valued me for who I was rather than what I was worth, and finding more joy in those simple pleasures than I had felt in years. Carlos, meanwhile, continued to tend my garden with the same dedication he had always shown, never asking for anything extra even when I deliberately tested him by leaving cash on the garden table, or mentioning that I was thinking of selling some valuable items to see if he would express any interest in them. Instead, he would just smile and tell me that the garden was looking beautiful, and that his wife wanted to know if I needed any more of her soup, and his children always sent their regards and asked if I wanted to come to their soccer games or school plays, which I started attending much to their delight. The contrast between Carlos's family, who welcomed me like a grandfather, and my own children, who saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM machine, became more pronounced with each passing day, reinforcing my decision to leave my fortune to people who would appreciate it and use it wisely. 2 months before the end, I staged what my children thought was a serious health scare, calling them to tell them I had collapsed and was being taken to the hospital, which was technically true, because I had arranged with my doctor to be admitted for a complete physical and some elective procedures I had been putting off. The speed with which they arrived at the hospital was impressive, though their concern was clearly not for my health, but for the possibility that this might be the end, and they needed to make sure they were present for any last-minute changes to the will or deathbed confessions about hidden assets. James actually brought a notary with him, just in case I wanted to sign anything, and Liz had her laptop ready to research any legal issues that might arise, while Bobby was already discussing with the nurses about end-of-life care and pain management options that would keep me comfortable but not extend my life unnecessarily. The looks on their faces when the doctor came out to tell them that I was fine and would be going home the next day after some minor procedures was priceless, with disappointment barely concealed behind forced smiles and hollow expressions of relief that dear old Dad was going to be okay after all. That night, as I lay in my hospital bed, I could hear them in the hallway arguing about whether I was faking it or if the doctors were hiding something, and James actually suggested that maybe they should get a second opinion from a doctor who might be more honest about my real condition, which showed just how deep their delusion and greed had become. The final act of my plan came together when I announced that I was feeling much better and wanted to have a family meeting to discuss my estate and make sure everyone understood my wishes, which sent my children into a frenzy of preparation and anticipation. They all cleared their schedules immediately, with Liz even flying in from a business trip in London and Bobby canceling a vacation he had planned, and James putting his latest business venture on hold, because this was apparently the moment they had been waiting for their entire adult lives. We met on a Sunday afternoon in the dining room of my house, the same room where they had plotted to have me declared incompetent, and I had arranged for David Steinberg to be present along with Carlos, who I had asked to attend without explaining why, much to my children's visible confusion and irritation. I began by telling them that I had been doing a lot of thinking about my legacy and what I wanted to leave behind, and I could see them leaning forward in anticipation, their eyes gleaming with barely concealed greed, as they waited for me to announce how I would be dividing my fortune among them. Then I dropped the bombshell, telling them that I had indeed updated my will, and that I wanted them to know exactly what they would be receiving, so there would be no surprises or confusion when the time came. And I watched their faces carefully as I explained their symbolic inheritances. James went pale when I told him about the pocket watch's mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as he tried to process what was happening, and Victoria, who had insisted on attending, actually stood up and accused me of being senile before David calmly informed her that I had been thoroughly evaluated and found to be completely competent. Liz started crying, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of rage, as she demanded to know what kind of father would disinherit his own children. And I calmly replied that I was the kind of father who had given them everything they needed to succeed in life, but had failed to teach them the difference between being successful and being good people. Bobby tried to argue that I was being manipulated by Carlos, obviously, but when I played the recording of their conversation about having me declared incompetent, he shut up immediately and slumped in his chair like all the air had been let out of him, because he knew there was no defending what they had said. Carlos, throughout all of this, looked absolutely stunned and kept trying to refuse the inheritance, saying it was too much and that he couldn't accept it, but I explained to him in Spanish, so my children could hear but not understand, that he had shown me more kindness and respect than my own blood, and that his family represented everything I had hoped my own family would become. I told my children that they had spent so much time calculating my worth that they had forgotten my value as a father and a human being, and that they had been so focused on what they would inherit that they had already lost the only inheritance that truly mattered, which was the love and respect of their father. The meeting ended with James storming out and threatening to contest the will, while Liz called me a monster and said that Mom would be ashamed of me, which was particularly hurtful, but also completely wrong, because Sarah would have been horrified by their behavior and probably would have disinherited them herself. Bobby just sat there in silence for a long time before finally asking if there was anything he could do to change my mind. And when I said no, he nodded and left without another word, which was somehow sadder than his siblings' anger, because it showed he understood exactly what he had lost and why. In the weeks that followed, my children tried everything to change my mind, from tearful apologies to angry threats to attempts at reconciliation that were so transparently motivated by greed that they only reinforced my decision to leave them with nothing but the truth about themselves. James had his lawyer send threatening letters about contesting the will on grounds of undue influence, but David had anticipated this and had made sure everything was so well documented that any challenge would be futile and expensive, which James couldn't afford without my money. Liz tried a different approach, sending me long emails about family memories and how much she loved me, but they read like form letters copied from the internet. And she couldn't help but mention how unfair it was to give family money to strangers, which showed she still didn't understand the point. Bobby was the only one who seemed to genuinely reflect on his behavior, sending me a short handwritten note that simply said he was sorry for losing sight of what really mattered, and that he hoped I would find peace with my decision, even if he couldn't understand it. Carlos, meanwhile, struggled with the news of his inheritance, feeling guilty about accepting it, until I explained to him that the money came with no strings attached, except that he used it to give his children the opportunities they deserved, and to help other hardworking families in his community achieve their dreams. He and Maria invited me to dinner at their small apartment, where their children hugged me and called me Abuelo Bill, and Maria cried as she thanked me for changing their lives, while serving me the best meal I had eaten in years, surrounded by more love and warmth than I had felt since Sarah passed away. As I write this, it has been 6 months since that family meeting, and I am still very much alive and healthier than I have been in years perhaps, because I no longer carry the burden of pretending that my children are people. They're not, or hoping they will change when they've shown me who they really are. Carlos continues to maintain my garden, but now as a friend rather than an employee, and his children visit me regularly to tell me about their school projects and soccer games, and to ask for help with their homework, which I gladly provide because they are eager to learn and grateful for the attention. My own children have largely cut contact except for holiday cards that are clearly obligatory and occasional emails asking if I've reconsidered my decision, which I haven't and won't, because some lessons can only be learned through consequences, and some mistakes can't be undone with apologies or tears. The irony is that if they had shown me even a fraction of the genuine care and respect that Carlos and his family showed me, they would have inherited everything without question. But they were so focused on the money that they forgot about the man, and in trying to take everything, they ended up with nothing. I don't know how much longer I have left on this earth, but I know that when my time comes, I will leave this world knowing that my fortune will go to people who understand its true value and will use it to build something beautiful rather than squandering it on empty status symbols and failed ventures. And perhaps that is the greatest inheritance I can leave behind, not just money, but a legacy of kindness, hard work, and the understanding that wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the love and respect we earn through our actions, and the way we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.